Well, good afternoon. My name is Deborah Sloan, and I am the president of the Northwest Ceramics Foundation. I would like to welcome you all to our presentation of Nova Scotia ceramic artist Neil Forrest. The Northwest Ceramics Foundation is grateful for and acknowledges it operates on the unceded, shared traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. We stand in solidarity with all communities marginalized due to race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or age, and commit ourselves to opposing racism in all its forms. To join our mailing list, please go to our website, www.nwca. At the top of every page, there's a blue button, which takes you to a form to sign up to receive our emails about upcoming events. Speaking of which, we would like to announce that our next speaker series event will include the two award-winning ceramic artists who work with aspects of production ware and design, Kate Metten and Kathy Terapolke. In April, these two artists will engage in a conversation with board member Carol Mayer, so please stay tuned. For the duration of the talk, we ask you to mute yourselves and turn off your videos. This will improve the transmission. At the end of the talk, we will have a discussion period during which you can turn your video back on. You can type questions into the chat function at the bottom of your screen or ask to be recognized during the discussion period. Please note this talk is being recorded. We will post the talk on our website, where you can also find other recordings of our previous Zoom presentation.
Thanks so much, Deb. Neil, I guess we're going to hand it over to you.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank Amy, Jen, Deborah, and all other members of the Northwest Ceramics Foundation. I feel very privileged to be asked to be part of this terrific series and have enjoyed the bits that I've seen so far of it. I'd also like to acknowledge personal friends, but colleagues, and we have such a large friendship circle, and many of them intersect, and thank you for joining us. And I really appreciate those of you who have supported me in the past. Some of you might be in the audience, and I appreciate that very much. I wanted to today do some things that were rather specific, and I'm really going to show two projects in primary projects, and a bit of a third one just to kick things off. But I wanted to say that as I've reached mid-career, I've really started to focus more and more on specific projects that require a certain amount of time to unfold and a certain amount of development to bring about one specific project. And you'll see when I start showing the slides, I'm going to pay homage to those individuals who in ceramics in particular have started to enlarge ceramics in some ways, perhaps by becoming involved in, I guess, what we can call installation art. But this sort of larger format that ceramics is historically occupied, but I think we've kind of forgotten some of that conversation at various points, historical points, and we've retaken the mantle in some ways. And so hopefully I'll touch on that a little bit in the work that I'm doing. I would say that I've evolved two streams of work, and it's possible that I can't be seen. Is that true? Can anyone let me know?
You're just fine here.
Okay, that's good to know. I was just given a message that it's possible that I wasn't being visible on screen. Okay, that's great.
Excuse me,
so
Neil.
I was saying that,
you
yes?
are in two places on the screen. One
So-
is not, one you can't see, one you
That's right.
can.
That's his camera one. The one you can see is his camera, and then the other one is just Neil talking. So you should look for the one with just Neil, and you can pin him to the top.
Okay. All right. And if anything else, the irregular technically comes up, feel free to let us know, and Jen will sort us out, I'm sure. But I've evolved in sort of mid-career 2 streams of work. One was a kind of rethinking of ornament, or thinking along with others about what ornament in a kind of postmodern condition could be like for, and I'm thinking here in architectural space. And so those strategies, I hope will be visible in the first 2 things that I show and focus on. The second thing really is where I'm at now, and it's a second stream that chases after specific questions of real topical and often, I guess I could say, anthropological or nature. And that's where the second project really goes. So I'm at this point, I'm going to take on the screen and start sharing my keynote. And hopefully that's visible to everybody.
Looks great.
The first image, okay, great. The first image here, it's not really a statement on the current problematics in Eastern Europe, but this is a photograph of the mid-19th century of a scene in the Crimea, which is particularly curious to me because of the amount of the high visibility of what we might call craft in this, the weaving, the masonry in there, and this remarkable, I think, quote by Emily Dickinson that I've never seen a better one. I wanted to show you a few historical things as a kind of backdrop to the work that I'm doing now, and essentially a few of my favorite things. And the Egyptian service in the Apsley House, this is in London, were you to go to London and go to the Duke of Wellington's residence, you would see this magnificent piece of porcelain that was done in the Sèvres factory. And you can see the date there. And what we're seeing here is only a taste of it. The whole room is a parade of remarkable things. Excuse me? Okay. And the next piece I wanted to show you was something by Ken Price. So those of you who would know the California ceramic artist, Ken Price, he produced one of the arguably first post-war installations, and he used pottery in the most remarkable way. And you can see this from around the same time that I began my interest in ceramics. And although I didn't know his work at the time, I think many of us have reviewed it and have indirectly or directly been inspired by the kind of thinking that he was bringing, the kind of joie de vivre in ceramics, and doing so in this sort of low fire, colorful way, where he's also integrating a number of kind of, I guess we could say, kind of ethnic questions that are involved in ceramics always, but they're usually kind of hidden, or they're spoken about in rather academic terms, or spoken of by other individuals other than ceramic artists themselves. Of course, the Judy Chicago piece, which is, I think it's on display permanently in the Brooklyn Museum. If you haven't seen it, it's a pretty remarkable thing. And something more recent, I didn't know Carrie Marbo, but a pretty interesting conceptual thinker from what I've gleaned, and someone I wish was still around, but is no longer with us. But doing this in a way that I think is respond more to conceptual art that would have been, really starting its generative bits in the 1960s and 70s. So I wanted to show you, as I said, 2.3 projects of mine. I'm going to show you a few images an early piece that I did around 1999, and then focus on two other kind of questions. I've tried to bring these things together under a question about the relationship of the techniques that we choose to do to execute something, and the expression that those techniques make another kind of content available to the work itself, or give it its sort of life and its particular temperament and personality. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pull that part off, but that's an aspiration of this afternoon. So that first project I'm going to show you a few slides of is one that actually started right close to where I live. I live near Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia. And at the urging of my wife at that time, we went down to Peggy's Cove, and we still do. And I picked up this diseased cone, and it sort of was a metaphor for illness, for something that was happening in my family. And it was looking for a way to lever that into a kind of imagery that would be interesting for a project that eventually became this thing called hiving mesh. And here's a drawing on the left that was done by someone else. And you'll see throughout the course of this presentation that I don't work alone. I have people that are friends, that are individuals that I approach, and people I contract to, and there are other individuals that I directly collaborate with. But there's a number of people who make often what we do possible that we couldn't do on our own. And here's the piece itself, hiving mesh. This was shown in the Belger Center in Kansas City, Missouri, and this is a hanging piece. So I began to think of it as a textile, and the challenge I gave myself that everything would be hanging. There's, I think, 1,000 pieces of porcelain as well. There's Egyptian faience in here. There's someone who may be in the audience who was a direct participant in the fabrication of this, and I thank her for that. And there is a hexagonal geometry that's behind this. And I was able to work this out with an architecture colleague of mine, Philip Beasley from Toronto. And we were able to figure out how all these individuals could be both separate but related in a three-dimensional matrix. So there's actually 3 screens here, and you'll see that in this side image. It will be hard to focus on it in the short duration. I'll have the slide up, but there's actually 3 different layers here, and there's this idea of a kind of, in my mind at least, a narrative of going through the first screen, which is colored and relates to. I was looking a lot at the social insects and reading I'm forgetting his name, the famous American specialist in bee biology, and the man who developed pheromone, understood what pheromones were, and so he had a whole kind of understanding of how insects related. And so I took that as a kind of opportunity to think how I could essentially colonize space, maybe not the same way as insects are able to kind of produce a hive, but it became apparent to me that one way we could think about filling space and ornamenting space using ceramics could be to liberate things from the wall, and not necessarily do they have to be affixed to the wall, as we have in many historic traditions, and wonderful traditions at that. So this is my idea of kind of separating out into individuals. And this is just another installation that I did elsewhere. It's the same every time, and I work with one person who helps me do this because he kind of understands the geometry and how to knit these 5,000 custom metal fittings that actually keep all these pieces at a very particular interval and distance from each other, so that the space is always equidistant between the objects, well, depending a little bit on the size of them. But the 2 things that I'm going to focus on today, and this first one, Flake, also follows that same idea of kind of thinking about a kind of object, an animate object, an object with animus even, that can fill a space. And this one I did at the Denver Museum of Fine Arts. I was one of a number of people that were approached by the curator to produce works for a specific exhibition. So we see Daniel Libeskin's sort of adventurous geometry on the left, and perhaps in counterpoint on the right screen is just a little image of the lead glaze on one of the pieces that I had hanging in there. So I wanted to go through the evolution of the piece, the development of it, because when one's working on a long project and one pins many hopes on whether or not you can pull it off technically, you want to make sure that you get a lot of things right and that you found the iteration that's most that's most meaningful to you, the most productive, and that kind of maximizes what you think the ideas should be. So these are flakes that actually are produced by the march and the appetite of a certain beetle that came through Nova Scotia, ate through the spruce trees, and in the wake of it, of this insect that was eating through the hard and the soft pulp of the rings of trees right on the property outside where I'm sitting right now, I was able to kind of salvage these fascinating shapes. And I worked with a young architect in town, and we looked at different ways that we could re-envision these into large kind of occupants of a big space. And on the bottom, we see a way in which two of those flakes, and I honed in on 5 different shapes. And my promise to the curator was, I will make the longest, biggest things that I possibly can. Now, I guess there's a certain amount of hubris in that. And I'm much younger then and thought I could do it. And I pretty much came up to my limits in this project. I knew I couldn't do it on my own. I could digitally had the resources in Nova Scotia and working with a few people that could really help me. But in terms of production, I knew this wasn't something that I could do on my own, and I had to find the best possible person. And that person, you'll see in the next slide coming up, it was in Kansas City, Missouri. Here's a way in which Yusuf and I tried to figure out how we could reshape these flakes, but rationalize them to produce a kind of architectural content that can reside within, just making a big red object, which is what you're going to see in a few minutes. And one of them was looking at a piece of geometry, the torus, the donut shape, and extracting from that the double curves that are in it. And I would try and reproduce those in these several ceramic objects that would be hanging at some point in the future in this museum. So that person I'm talking about is Andy Brayman. A number of you would know who he is, probably one of the smartest people of his generation. And I know most of us know him as a potter, but he has a huge studio. He has the most technically sophisticated, I think, approach to ceramics of anyone that I've met. And I know there's others. We have seen some of those actually in this speaker series who have really figured out a lot of really interesting machinery, but have also figured out how to relate the digital to the very manual haptic kind of approach most of the rest of us take to ceramics. And Andy is able to apply that. So I pitched this project to him, went down to his studio, lived in an adjacent studio, several thousand square feet, and we did this project in a number of weeks. I was running a parallel project in Nova Scotia at the very same time, trying to make sure that I could actually produce something. So we made many molds, and the molds were actually this extruded polystyrene. So here it is. He's cutting parts of it. This will all be unified as a single mold. You'll see that fairly soon. But we took a simpler approach in Nova Scotia, and although these curves were the same ones that Andy was working with in other digital files before my arrival. You can see Matt Karras on the right helping me, and I worked with the same young architect you saw do those renders in the last couple of images. And we produced this curve, and Matt here is working on a mold, but we're doing this one, a mix of, manually, digitally organized, shall we say, digitally drawn, but then amplified and enlarged. And then we were able to produce this this mold, and then this mold would also be a kind of flipping device that would take an object and turn it upside down. So I would be able to work on the same curves, but with different objects in two cities simultaneously. That was the plan. So now I take us back to Kansas City. So we're in Andy's part of the studio, and in the lower left on your screen, you'll see Andy's in the red shirt with an assistant, and he has built this ram press. So this is not a ram press that he bought from the Ram company in Ohio or wherever they have their facilities. He actually made this ram press. And one of the reasons what was so attractive in going to Andy's studio is that I knew that we could do so many different techniques in his studio. And even though they're ultimately simple objects that I'm producing, they would involve certain, there's a complex nature to our idea about how they would be fabricated. And in the upper right, we see the both sort of central image is the sort of male part of the ram press mold. To the right of that is the kind of female part, and below are Andy on the right and two assistants that's from the Kansas City. They're from the Kansas City Art Institute. These are the kind of bricks that are going to be on the obverse side eventually of the object that I'm making that will stiffen it, because anything that's, as we increase the size of something and occupy more space and it requires more structure, it requires a greater degree of engineering. But I also wanted to take engineering from the another animate world, which was, as you saw in the first set of slides, the insect world. So these are really based on hive shapes, but we designed them as bricks that had an elliptical interior, a shaved and meaning an angled kind of exterior. So all these bricks would go together, a kind of corrugation, as it were, that would fit on the obverse side of these big, essentially long slabs. And they would provide the stiffness, the structure to it. So that was the kind of engineering portion, was figuring out what would be an appropriate kind of shape that we could manage in a ram press mold, and then fit onto a giant slab and come up with the clay bodies and all the surfaces and glazing that would all harmonize. And we were doing this all in kind of a short order. So here's the molds. We see Bowie on the left and Sarah Gross on the right, who's now teaching in the US. On these sawhorses, we can see these kind of stepped molds. So to reduce the amount of to make it possible in his small CNC machine that we saw several slides ago, Andy put a kind of a graduated kind of pedestal on which the extruded polystyrene shapes could be adhered to, and then we could use these molds multiple times, and we could flip these off. So all these objects you're seeing are the obverse side, and they have all been cut to the shape of these particular flakes. And remember, these flakes are all based on the activity of spruce budworms. Those were those very hungry beetles I was describing earlier that created the shapes for which I was inspired to make this piece. So, and once one works into an entirely different scale, then I think the original object in some ways fades into the distance, but it's generative power of its kind of shape and form, one hopes it still resides there, even though one is translating it or reinterpreting it in a different way. I'm not expecting you to actually be able to go through this this cluster of many slides, but I would just tell you, if we start in the top right, this is a finished piece, and I may have got some of these slides out of order, but this is the way in which we took an object that had to be built upside down, because those kind of cell forms with the elliptical shapes on them, they have to get turned over and form the opposite side. We had to build these kind of this sort of flipping cradle. So Andy, extremely adept carpenter, called a friend of his over. You can see his pal in the central slide there, and eventually this big flipping device. And now, if you start looking through, we get to the bottom, and we have actually flipped the object. So apologies for not producing this as a video, but I think I was too nervous at the time to be recording. But I was able to take a few pictures during the flipping process. And so we were able to take this huge object and lift it over, because each of these would weigh, I'm sorry, I'm going to give you this in imperial measure, probably some of them would be as light as 60 pounds, 80 pounds, and then others would be 250 pounds, which were, and kind of fragile until fired. So there was a lot of kind of improvisational engineering along the way, because none of this stuff was, we didn't have a plan of how we would do everything. We had an idea of how we would make the ceramic objects, but not how we would get them into the kiln. So the kiln was another thing, because the kiln actually hadn't been made at this point, and that also involves the skills of another individual, Dave Fredrickson, who used to be the kiln tech at Alfred and has a kiln company called Fredrickson Kilns, and we'll see some of his handiwork in a few minutes. So we see here, although we're looking at the long axis, so we don't really see the length of these objects, but we see how slender they are, and they are flakes, and so they need to be slender just by definition. And we see the cradles that are underneath them. So there had to be a cradle. It's not as carefully built, but it's still fairly secure and sturdy. And then we see here a kind of manifold that with all these little vinyl tubes that sort of almost run like looks like a surgical unit in a hospital. And we were able to dry these pieces as quickly as possible, because we had a very, very short turnaround time for these objects. So we had forced air into each object, but just tiny amounts of forced air that we were constantly, kind of pushing away the humid air to get rid of them. So this is the studio on the right at a certain point when we started to have the objects that were being best. And in a second, I'm going to be able to show you this kiln. So I designed the kiln, and Dave Fredrickson built it, and he palletized it and shipped it out in very short order. He didn't really think I was serious about me building it, so he put it off till I was in the panic mode, and he produced this kiln. So the kiln is about 12 feet long. And the idea, it's a breakdown kiln, and each kiln panel is 2 feet by 2 feet. So we could take the kiln apart and load it so that we didn't have to, handle the pieces, which were quite fragile, and so that we could push them in off his small kind of forklift in there. And then we made a lid for the top, and this is all done very, as I said before, a lot of it was improvised. Some of it was well planned. It's a real mixture. So now we are at the Denver Art Museum, and these are the two installation techs that are figuring out ways to install them. You can see that there's several installed in the background, and the museum has, very irregular kind of ceiling height, so you can see that how high they had to go up to start installing it. And I had to design a system so that the pieces could be hung. There was no certainty in absolutely how we would hang it. So I created a kind of pin cushion, kind of a series of holes that go all the way through each piece. And then we actually pre-hung them in a small device, and then we knew actually which holes to pick, and then we would hang them from the ceiling. And so it all actually worked as planned, and that was pretty remarkable on its own. Here's the obverse side. So now we're seeing the kind of cell structure based on I would just say the anatomy of insect habitat, but mostly looking at wasps and bees, those kinds of insects that kind of build their house around them. And that was the kind of feeling I wanted for this. But in some ways I call them bricks, but in other ways they're just kind of stiffening modules for the piece itself. And you can see all those different sort of hanging on the slide on the right. You can see all the little holes. So we had a choice of where we would do them, and I did them uniform, and it sort of works out with the idea of kind of ornament. And you can see the piece was hung in a way. The idea was that, in fact, originally to have more pieces, and I would create a kind of fragments of a bowl or a kind of almost amphitheater shape. Perhaps I didn't get to that critical mass, but enough of them that they could hang together. So there was a kind of very kind of singular placement strategy that they all have to have in space. So it was tremendous work that was done by the installers, because they had to kind of guess in the ceiling where these things would go. And there's the piece hanging. The one on the top left is probably the longest. That's probably around 10 plus feet long, and all the other ones are kind of graduated downward. So and I think there's 4 molds represented in here. So it was a remarkable project that I couldn't realize on my own, but it took a lot of kind of experimentation all the way through the process, and being able to take a risk. I'm not sure I could take a lot of risks like this, but there are moments in your life where you have ideas and you chase them down, and then you find out the people usually smarter than yourself who can make them happen. And I think this, my interests have always been in some ways in lockstep with architecture, and you'll see that in this project here. And so I called it Porous, because it was supported by the Norwegian Artistic Research Council. I was teaching at the Oslo National Academy of Art at the time, and they have remarkable support for the arts. So I pitched this project, and it was simply this: I want to take on as my research question as I thought of it, a problematic in ceramics of the material itself, not necessarily a virtue, a problematic, and that problematic was porosity. Normally we try and suppress it. I wanted to kind of figure out how I could ask questions around it. So this became a kind of sprawling project, not near as focused as the last one. The results go a very kind of plural. It was certainly not homogeneous in any sort of way, but I kind of could see that coming. And so I decided to indulge myself and say, I'm going to put in everything that I want in this thing. And perhaps I did. So we see this part of the inspiration I took was the thing that artists and architects and landowners would want, and that's a grotto. We're kind of interested in these spaces. They're naturally derived. We love going to caverns. We love searching out these things that are kind of hidden in the earth, that hide from the natural sun and daylight. They're mysterious. They're interesting. And to that list, I added cisterns and some other things. And on the right, in this rather incomplete kind of way of listing the, the challenges and the opportunities in the project. I listed porosity and its close associate in my mind, solubility, solubles, and then crystalline structures. So those were the kind of numerous things that I thought would be at play in this, should be at play in this project. And so I looked at different things. I looked at salt production in China. Traditionally, what we see on the left, I guess, is traditional, but it's also contemporary. And something else that meant a lot to me, and this is the architectural idea component to the piece, is the idea of cisterns. So cisterns they associate water and vessels, but in a more public way, or at least in a group way, if not public. We could say public, because this cistern would be supplying other places. I personally haven't been there, but I've been to the great Roman cistern in Istanbul, and it is one of those touchstone images. It's architecture, it's water, it's a cavern, it's everything. And still, I would, I'll think of it on my last days on the planet as one of the great things that I've seen. The other thing I associate with is terms of background. We have the Tuileries public garden. My apologies to those of you who speak French. And this is the great project by the mastermind, the great French polymath and Renaissance man, Bernard Palissy, who I thought just made kitsch platters. Boy, was I wrong and now embarrassed about how I first thought of the production of this man. And the lower right is a picture of him, which apparently in an event that happened, he was trying to get a firing done, and he was tearing apart his own furniture from his house, much to the horror of his family and his wife, to finish off his firing. But this is one dedicated man. But he was, as I say, a polymath. He did many things. Now, the upper left corner, which is I guess I could say a relatively recent, it's probably a 19th century a kind of exhumation, where they were looking for this grotto that he was commissioned to build by Catherine the Great. Anyways, forgetting who his patron was on this. And although it's never been found, Simon Schama, the great art historian, has written about it. So it remains this sort of mystery that those of us who are kind of keen on it can answer in our own way as to what the grotto was. And so this project Porus it was my answer to what the grotto should be. So I always start by doing drawings. I feel that there's all these kind of stages. Sometimes I don't draw before I make things, but this project involved a lot of drawings. There's a lot of objects in here, placeholder objects. They don't really mean anything, but they're trying to get a feeling for the kind of atmosphere I wanted to create, and thinking grotto and what might be in it. I started thinking about other kinds of vessels and what they could be as an architectural structure. So you can see me kind of playing here, and I'm thinking I-beams. So a modern component of architecture, which is the I-beam. And I started, plugging in imagery to it. This doesn't say anything about I-beam here, but I did build one. You'll see it a little bit later. And then as I started thinking of other ways in which to envision the project, because it would unfold over a schedule of several years, that I needed to know more about it. And if you're, want someone to exhibit it, they need to know more about it. They have every right to know more about it. And I had Narn Devar, who's a local, at the time, just a graduating architect from Dalhousie. And he did these renders for me that would help me kind of think of how it could look. And I work very closely with another architect in Halifax, Peter Henry, good friend of mine. And we would have these very interesting kind of visioning sessions to help me figure out the architectural component. And my friend Peter used the word datum. And, datum is a very broad word. It means as much a kind of procedure as it maybe more than it means a thing. But we started thinking about it as a thing, as this surface on which activities would happen, be performed, or house or host. And that's what I wanted to build here. So this had to be rationalized. There was a certain place eventually that I knew that it was going. It's around 40 feet long. I needed a flat surface to build on. So I worked with my own carpenter from here in rural Nova Scotia, and he came into Halifax, and we built this at the art college, this ramp, and it goes up to 24 inches at the back, which falls in lockstep with what the building codes are, that you don't need guardrails around these things. And every object that you see here that's kind of plugged into this datum, or it's a ramp, are sort of cardboard dummies. The objects hadn't been made. They had been conceived, but they hadn't been made. Perhaps some of them had. And so I wanted to know where they would go, the carpenter. And so several things in the project had to happen simultaneously. And so we realized this would be rendered best in being built rather in both wood and this kind of industrial mesh, because the mesh itself was enough that people could stand on. So I actually began to think of this thing. It's a grotto, and a grotto is a place that you can walk through. So the object that I built, you needed to walk through the object itself, and one would kind of be a flaneur and walk through and just be able to kind of consider and contemplate these various objects. Now, the other thing that I gave myself in this is I said everything has to be a square, based on a square, a circle, and all the colors had to come out of Greek pottery. It was, these were just parameters that I set out, because ceramics is, of course, I'm a ceramist. It's at the core of what I do, but it's a sort of a mix and match approach. It's a way to give structures to the things that interest me. And, I wasn't particularly interested in Greek pots, when I was young, didn't like them. Now I'm just crazy about them for the narrative content, but for the blending, the simple blending of these range of browns and near blacks. And so these are things that are also kind of running in the background of this project. But in the foreground, we have here CNC milling. And so I worked very closely with a former student of mine who was, there have been two great mold makers that have come out of NASCAD. One of them may be attending this lecture, Eliza Au, and the other is Sanduk Yu, who I work with frequently. He has what he calls a maker's lab in Seoul, Korea, and now with the supply chains being they are in the world, you can work anywhere in the world, and you work with the people who you want to, that can do the job. And Sanduk is brilliant, and he's working here with the Korean porcelain. So he milled the molds, and what I said, I gave him a rough drawing. He then rendered it in Rhino, and you can see here these kind of, I saw them as grids, and they would be hosting these crystals that I wanted to grow, because everything from this grotto had to originate in the grotto, and crystals and solubles and the dripping of water. These are all things that one would find in a cavern and sometimes in cisterns. And I wanted to create this experience. This was the kind of phenomenalness of the experience. I don't mean that as a kind of the phenomena, I should say, not phenomenal. I wanted to create some certain a set of phenomena, and to do so, there had to be a few things lined up. So one of them would be these hosts, almost like you'd find in a beehive, but instead of actually producing honey, I wanted to produce crystals. And so I'm sort of jumping in to develop the themes of this piece. I'm not showing you the whole of the object yet. I'm kind of holding back on that. I'm showing you certain objects that you would have seen, cardboard versions of a few slides ago. And now here are some of the objects that were just sort of, sketched out before. Here they are. So here are a series. I kind of consider this like a file folder. Like a filing cabinet. I've got one behind me right now, very old school. And my filing cabinet would have these beautiful grids of porcelain, kind of like from a beehive, perhaps. And they have all been dipped for various amounts of time in different soluble liquid baths. And then I work with some students that I hired here at NASCAD in Nova Scotia, and they would time them, and then they would be putting them in and out of these baths, kind of like what we saw in the Chinese salt production facilities, until I had the amount of crystalline structure, crystalline accumulation rather, that I wanted on each of these individuals. And you can see here in this object, this sort of filing cabinet, there's a cutout. So everything has its space, and the geometry is all conforms to the objects. And so you won't find it all orthogonal, which is to say right angle geometry in the datum itself. You get these kind of placements that are irregular. And that's because I wanted to create a kind of story about how you walk through this, up this ramp. So now we see here the crystals kind of flashing in the foreground here, and how beautifully accurate these objects are. Senduk did a beautiful job. He fired them in Seoul, and then he sent them to me. He packaged them up and sent them to me. Meanwhile, in Halifax, I'm developing this high pressure, high volume spray system. And these are just the tests I did. So I would do, hundreds of hours of spraying to accumulate, to create these other kinds of objects that were porous. And these objects are porous not because I designed a kind of open structure in the clay. I will show you how I did that later. But these are, I reasoned that I noticed that when you spray stuff, usually glaze, the way it accumulates on the ceramic object is rather unique, and there's a lot of space between each particle. Why? Because the water is drying off on its way there to the object. So I thought, well, I'll just build objects that are essentially sprayed objects. I'd create a kind of substructure, which you see on the left, and I would hang these meter-long things, and then I would just spray them until I got shapes like you see on the right. I also found that I tested them by creating these sort of inner manifolds that liquids could actually transit through, and they could self-color. Now, I abandoned this part of the project, but it's something that sits in the back of my mind. So you could see on the left a colored liquid traveling through. And then I really settled on this, was growing crystals. And some were too fragile to use, some types, and others were just right. But I had no idea how hard it would be to culture crystal structures on clay. But I can assure you, it doesn't work in every case. Now, okay, there's my cue to run a video. So what we're seeing here is crystals that I was able to grow inside these ceramic objects. And this is the hard thing to do, it turns out, is to grow crystals inside of objects. Crystals like to accumulate on the outside of very delicate objects like strings, etc. But, over time we were able to manage crystals, and I worked with a young student who was quite interested in this kind of crystalline chemistry, and she was good in geology. So she sort of spearheaded this part of the project and was able actually to subvert the growth of crystals. So some of these are misfiring, shall we say, in the kind of process. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead. So here's a still of that. So we see the front of the ramp. So this is the kind of welcome portal is that you walk by all these colors. So my idea in this project is that that the color would not actually come from glazing, as you saw in the previous project, because everything was terra sigillata. It was all kind of Greek pottery. But all the color that I would put in it, which was just really at this sort of opening portal to the object itself, or to this datum, the color would come from the crystal. So I had to find that kind of those sort of solubles that would turn crystals into interesting kind of colors, because that would be where the bouquet of the color schemes would happen. Objects I'm not going to show you, but just some close-ups. So some of the things that I was telling you that were sprayed objects that I used a high pressure spray system, these are those objects. And then I grew crystals on these. So we created these big sort of baths, out of vapor barrier and cinder blocks. And then we just put lots of kind of chemicals in them. And this is teens, by the way, this project around 2000s, started doing this around 2014, 2015. So I was able to grow certain sort of crystals on these objects as well. And then I built these meter-long kind of trays for them. These are all, they're all brightly colored, they're lead glazed trays. But I just thought I'd show you how I built one of the objects. And I have to thank one of my graduate buddies, Walter McConnell, who is a retiring professor from Alfred University this very semester, in fact. He came up with this idea. You can see these holes that are on the side of the piece. So the object was very heavy to build. You see it in the bottom right, inserted into the datum itself. Some of these things I just sort of plugged into the side of the datum. They were very heavy. So some of those holes are for drying. You see on, let's look at the image in the bottom right. The smaller holes are for drying, but the two larger holes are so that I could put holes or poles, and I put steel pipes through them when the piece was greenware, i.e. the other 3 slides you'd see, and we could actually lift it into the kiln this way. It turned out this was the heaviest piece. This weighed about, I don't know, it was ridiculous, about 350 pounds. But I wanted this kind of angular vocabulary that I was eventually able to soften. And everywhere that you see a hole in the bottom left piece, I put paper and other materials, and then I began spraying and accumulating this roughly a kind of version of my casting slip that would then accumulate and build up. So it's a very fragile top, but a very robust bottom, because it's on my stoneware clay. And there's the object itself. See, squares. I promised myself I would do everything as squares, and circles, or circles extruded become kind of cylindrical things. And so we'll see some of that. Now I want this gets into hopefully the last stage of things I'm going to show you. I needed to create manifolds inside objects, so ways in which I could push air and water mixes through the clay itself, because I wanted to have this sort of underground experience. And I thought, well, I will create these sort of small atomizers. Atomizing is sort of creating very, very small kind of droplets of water. And that I decided to create through high pressure. So a plumbing system and an air compressor system. So I had to figure out how to build this plumbing system inside of clay. So these were first projects that proved rather futile, but I was able to nail them after a while. In the end, I had a plumbing system because I worked with a young engineer from Dalhousie School of Engineering. He was the brains behind all of this. I had the theory and the aspiration, and he helped me realize the kind of mechanics of it, because this is a kind of a grotto that's scientifically or mechanically assisted. So it's a kind of postmodern grotto, as it were. And you can see the massive compressor I needed on the right that I had to buy for the project that was hidden in the museum, I don't know, 50, 75 meters away. And it noisily chugged away, but the gallery itself was spared the noise of the mechanics. Here's the mixing board at the front. So it's compressed air and water mixing panel. So you see that in the kind of center bottom. So you could actually control it. So it's like a mixing board in a music studio, I suppose. And I was able to three of the objects this was designed to control the flow of moisture through. You can see it dancing on one of the pieces on the right, where you see, two circles and a square. We'll get to that, I think, after this slide. So these are some of the wet works, and these are little reservoirs. So the kind of rectangular forms that house the rods in the background and the circle and square in the piece on the right. There's actually water and air under pressure feeding each of those tablets or rods in the background at the top, and they will drip down into these reservoirs or cisterns, and then they go back into a bigger reservoir and they get recycled. So in theory, it's a kind of straightforward bit of plumbing that's in the piece itself. Here's my cue to run the video. Can you hear that? Oh gosh, this could be a mistake on my part. What you should be hearing is a kind of hissing sound, but I'm not sure that you are. And for that, I'm sad, because all these objects, there's air and water being pushed through them. So wherever you see, like in the background there, we're honing in on an object. Everywhere that you see the sort of bubbles and that sort of the water that's dancing on the top, that's creating a soundscape in the gallery. So there was a kind of auditory component. I didn't really foresee how strong that would be, but once it was installed, I had heard it in the, when I was building it with my assistant, but hearing it in the gallery was really quite wonderful, because it was freed from all the other sounds of the construction space, the fabrication space, and now you hear it as you would if you were to perhaps go underground and experience a grotto. A few other things that I threw in, and this is where I should be picking up the pace. I'd seen scientific vessels that were done by the Wedgwood company. So Josiah Wedgwood, prior to where there was a great glassware industry in the production of scientific flasks, Josiah Wedgwood was producing them for the scientific industry and technical industries. And I just was so charmed by this. I saw that in the one of the museums in London, Museum of Industry. And so I built my own, and I built them in this long single, object, and just all these sort of vessels tumbling together. And sort of finally, I wanted to pay homage to those people who, helped me realize the project, but also my love of architecture. So I picked two buildings that were important to me. One, an old Stav or post and beam church, these mysterious churches in Norway. And when I was kind of living there, I would go and visit them when I could. And they're just remarkable buildings. You're only seeing just one. So it's kind of my ship in a bottle. So I have these sort of big cisterns around them and these objects in them. And they're kind of a loving gesture to house these buildings. They're not, they're not prisoners in there. That's not my intention. They're just objects to be venerated. And so that's a kind of almost this kind of sentimental part of it. And we see on the left, maybe I'm not so sentimental, we have this very modern building by the great, but recently passed Norwegian architect Sverre Fehn, and his great museum design. And I just am visited the building, but it's a wonderful series of shapes that worked out well for what I wanted to do in this project. And so you see that on the left, and you see how this long datum or ramp kind of unfolds on the right. And here we are visiting the back of it again. And an object. And there it is on the side. Another bit. And I think that is the last image of, yes, that is the last thing. And I leave you with my next project, which I'd better not say anything about, or we'll be here forever. But I'm going to stop share. And hopefully people can, if any of you are remaining and want to ask a question, I know Jen's moderating, and she knows that I can take stuff and chat, but I'm very happy to hear, and most happy to hear your voice if you want to speak directly, which would be lovely.
Thank you, Neil. That was kind of breathtaking. There's time if you want to talk about a little bit about your next project.
Well, you know, there would be so much prelude just for me to make sense. I'll say this much. This is a little drawing that I've done of the surface of Mars with a battalion of astronauts that I drew and have kind of marching across. So this is just a kind of a way for me to start thinking about this project. And maybe the thing that I would say, Deborah, and thank you for inviting me, I'll just say that half of the work that I do now is with a collaborator, and his name is John Rolliff. And John used to be head of sculpture at the San Francisco Art Institute. And John and I curated a project together. We had Claire Toomey in it, and Walter McConnell, and a couple of other folks that were in it, up and coming. And you know, we realized that we had a lot of things in common. So we said, okay, we'll curate something together. Now we're going to make something together. And that's proved to be, in the sort of last act of my career, it proved to be quite wonderful to be able to kind of share things and work together. I mean, it's not always easy, but John brings together a kind of, John brings a lot of qualities that I don't have. And, you know, there's something apparently that I have for him, working with him. But we're doing a project in San Francisco over the next 3 years, and it's going to take place. It's going to be a project that starts on our planet but ends on Mars, and we hope it ends well, but we don't yet know. But it's you know, we're happy that we have a home for this project. Not at liberty to say much about it at the moment, but it is a really interesting thing to do, is to be able to work with another person and sort of navigate, you kind of double up on the number of ideas that you would, you know, never be able to achieve on your own. So that's where I'm headed with John, is a project that we'll say has a lot to do with, we'll have some puppets on Mars by the end of it all. But there we go. So if anyone has something to comment, critique, or ask, I'd be willing to hear it.
Thank you, Neil. That is great. And there are some comments in the chat, and people being astounded with your porosity project and your crystal building. And
yeah,
I think I should hand it over to Jen if Jen wanted to carry on with anything that she wants to say. but this was terrific. And thank you so very, very much. There
My
you go.
pleasure.
Thanks, Deb. And Neil, just amazing. How about I just read a few of the chats out so people can
Okay.
get some of that. So Liza
Yeah.
all said that the Forrest project was fascinating and she learned so much about it, and air compression techniques in clay is fascinating. Also growing the crystals. And
Okay, can I say,
yeah, please do.
can I just hop in there and say one thing that, oh, I'm really showing my age. Yeah, anyways, I'll come back to it later, but please go ahead.
Jen, could we get rid of the share screen so we can see
Sure.
more
Neil,
people?
would
'Cause
you
right
mind
now all
turning
we
off
see
the
is,
share screen
Oh,
for us?
Yeah.
me? Okay, all right.
thanks.
Let me do that. Oh, okay, right. All right.
So Amy, you have
Is
your
that-
hand up. Did you have another thought or question? Oh, you're muted, Amy.
That was fabulous, Neil. I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to apologize. At the beginning, Deb got cut off all of a sudden, so she didn't get to introduce you. And so I
Oh.
put a bit of the, you must have thought, what the heck? What's going on? I put most of the introduction into the chat so people can read a little bit more about you. And it was
Oh, thank you.
completely, it was a technical glitch. It's definitely not intentional. But my question was, in one of the Glenn Brown articles on you, which was about hard transit, it mentioned
Yep.
He picked up on an autobiographical connection between your being from a northern country, Canada, moving to Norway when you were first going there, and he seemed
Yep.
to really play on that. And I'm wondering if you draw an autobiography. I was thinking like those trees that were on your property. And what kind of a role does autobiography come in terms of deciding on the sorts of projects you are interested in doing?
It's a lovely question, Amy. I would say that, I would say a lot of the work that I did for a long time didn't, had historical resonances, but often not personal or perhaps I could say even private ones, until I did the hiving mesh project, which, as I said, was a bit of a, maybe I was reading Susan Sontag at the time, but it was also something about illness. And I had seen this, Sheila had shown me this tree that had been wind clipped and diseased. And, I saw something in that as a metaphor. And I don't think I'd ever really thought about a metaphor before. I mean, we think about them in literature and we know they exist in art, and but it wasn't part of a discourse that was available to me, or that I had availed myself of. It's a better way of putting it. And I would say that it allowed me to think a little bit more of an inward way. And I would say that was a real watershed moment for me. And so I started thinking about things that related more personally to me. And part of it is that kind of an insect colonies. Even that is, it's both, I don't know, outside my purview, but also, something that I could kind of witness and choose and elect to think about. And it was, co-sharing, as it were, with, the planet. And so, I think there's a little bit of an awakening there. Norway was interesting because I realized, and this is a little unfair to talk about in front of other people who, don't know this piece, but that hard transit, which are essentially four, I'll call them Norwegian frigates, 17th, 18th century ships, that were all part of Norway's, what put them on the map in some ways internationally was that they explored the north. They were curious about themselves and they're part of the planet. But we too in Canada, we think of Glenn Gould's idea of North for those of us who are boomers, and for those who are younger in more recent generations. You may know that Canada there has been a lot of thinking about our relationship to the North. We're of course reevaluating that in relationship to the peoples of the North, but in the past it was more of the way that the Western idea of exploring, the unknown. And now it's a much richer tapestry because we realize it's exploring an unknown that's inhabited, but some of it is not inhabited. And I started thinking about that when I went to Norway. Well, I'll do something about the Norwegians, but I still felt that was personal. And what I, from some of the people that I talked to when I hung these 4 ships, which each of them had inside a piece of architecture that related to Norway's past. They would be part of famous buildings or infamous buildings, and they were inside, and you only knew they were inside. You could peek in there, but it wasn't like looking at a dollhouse and you know what you're looking at. You had to look at the wall drawings that I had done and posted on the wall, and then the two things start to correspond. But also thinking about other, their issues were fascinating for me, because that's maybe not my biography, but I was, I remember the first project I did when I was a kid. I don't remember anything that was academic that I did in public school, but I do remember when we did drawings and we envisioned what the people of the North were like, the Inuit, all very naive, but we should also take pleasure and cherish those sort of naive things, because they can produce powerful and long-lasting effects. And later in life, I was able to go up to the North and meet some Northerners. So yeah, that was sort of a return to childhood. In fact, that project, in a roundabout way, but it was all done through a kind of discourse about a problem and a celebration about the Norwegian expeditionary forces, not forces, but expeditions in the North. And we too in Canada did that. Now that's mostly due to John Franklin and all the Brits who went, but this is all part of that story of exploration, and every people has done it, every culture has done it, and we all visit other territories that we're not that we ourselves didn't find ourselves originating in, that we move around. This is the kind of curiosity about the kind of people we are. That's why I suppose we're all thinking about Mars and the lunar landing 3 days ago now, and all those things are kind of fascinating, because we're often just that curious. Sorry.
Thank you.
Meg's
I see Meg has her hand up. I don't know, Jen, if you're
Yeah.
ask Meg.
Hi, Meg.
Hi, Neil. My question was, you mentioned specifically about the Forrest project, how it was less directed and less focused than your Flake project, and I believe they were immediately preceding each other. So my question was, how did you sort of unify all the disparate questions and ideas that you had, most of them relating to porosity and how you could integrate that with a ceramic medium and all of those explorations, but then you also included pieces of architecture that were interesting to you, pieces of your personal history, pieces of past projects, questions about grottos and other artists that you were interested in, all of these very, very separate artistic ideas, and sort of what was the process of distilling those into the final piece?
Meg, it's a question that I've asked myself many times. So you are poking that bear in my imagination that doesn't have an answer. I would say this, that it's very messy, that project. But I think we've come to a point in the production of all things cultural, whether it's in dance or fiction writing, where we don't have to hold to the kind of standards that previous periods flourished with. So I realized very early on in that project that I would either have to eliminate a ton of stuff that I was just compelled to visit, or I would just say, no, it's going to be messy, and there will be a few rules that I'll create, i.e. the Greek pottery rule, which is say everything's going to be terracage, and it's going to be from the ochres to the terracottas that are all found on various Greek pots. There's nothing outside of it. There's nothing that I did that was Roman in their colors. It was all Greek. So I gave myself a few basic rules. I rationalized it, I think, in the end, and maybe I have justification for doing so. I say, it's kind of a narrative about water and about an experience, and I think I felt I needed all those things to complete that experience, because, and when I say experience, not a personal experience, but the idea that you're designing a kind of an experience. Also, at that time, I was reading the great Merleau-Ponty, by the way, which I only delved into the first chapter of, but who writes about phenomenology, and so, in other words, the way the body experiences the actualities and the phenomena of our plural, of our world, of our daily existence, that there's sound, and that there's a plethora, a multitude of things, and our experience is one that's not that's always it's not always cohesive. So my feeling was, this is a one-time opportunity. People, will judge me on it. I'll do as best I can in pulling everything together. That was the reason for the datum as well. It's not only the love of architecture, it was the idea that, well, what does a building do? It sort of can pull things together that are quite diverse. So there was a lot of, I don't know that the strategy's ever shifted, but I created a bunch of rules. Some of them came in real time during the making of it. I don't believe that they all, that it produced a kind of singular result of any sort. But it's messy, I would say, and I just hope it's messy in a reasonably interesting way. It certainly was for me to make. I worked with a ton of people on it, and it was kind of like nobody knew what each were doing, and that was also interesting for me, is that it was kind of being a bit of an orchestra leader who had very limited capabilities. But we all seem to end on on the right note. That's how I look at it.
It's a good answer, Neil. Thanks.
Anyone
Thanks.
else have some questions for Neil? Or some conversation? Deb, I think you're muted there.
Here we go. what point in your career, Neil, did you start to really use collaboration? Was it right at the beginning, or did you sort of grow into it as you met people throughout all your travels?
Well, Deborah, I want to make a distinction between collaboration and, I'm not sure what the best way of putting this is, but there's a whole number of people I approached to do things for me ever since I did that piece that I started with. That's why I want to show you Hiving Mess, because that was the first piece that I couldn't do on my own.
Okay, yeah.
Yet I can't say that I really collaborated. There were times that I got absolutely essential of advice for which the piece, were I not to have that advice, it would have absolutely collapsed and failed. I mentioned the architect Philip Beasley, who has gone on to a huge and fascinating, interesting career. But we met each other when we were at the sort of right time in our careers. He helped me kind of visualize the geometry by which this could work. I told him what I kind of wanted to make, and we were both a little bit interested in the things that were going on in architecture at that time, because architecture had blossomed from the rigidity of modernism and all the other kind of wonderful isms, which I appreciate, brutalism, whatever. I love looking at Robarts Library in Toronto and all things that are supposed to be verboten, in terms of good architecture today. But, I started, I think it was that moment where I crossed my line as a ceramic artist. I still stay in my own lane for the most part, but I saw what was possible with interdisciplinary thinking, which I had never really, I knew how important it was in the fine arts. I kind of came to realize that was important in architecture, that interdisciplinary. But I always felt that we have to keep our core discipline. And that's the conversation that I usually have with people I work with, some of whom I collaborate, which is to say that I take that we have to share in the authorship. But there's a lot of things, like when I have worked with some, former students and San Duc, they're not necessarily collaborations, even though I take his input, but they're the things that we get. It's like when a musician works with a producer who has a probably a massive shaping element to what that musician does. I think of, a favorite musician of mine is David Bowie. But it was, it was his producers, and he had several, that helped him realize the idea. Now, they don't get much credit, something on the liner note. And for that, we, the audience, should be in some ways responsible to know more about, why these people do great things. But it's partly because people are, they're applying their various skills, sometimes collaboratively, sometimes sharing in similar but different ways. So I would have to say interdisciplinarity is important, but sometimes I think we do things that we call interdiscipline, but I don't know that they really are. Are we really crossing over into another discipline? Or are we just sort of borrowing some information from that discipline? So I think we have to be critical, or at least aware enough of what we're doing that we don't overstate or, perhaps understate. But what we think of as what is proper interdisciplinary thinking.
That's a terrific answer, because it really separates out all the different levels of collaboration and interdisciplinary thinking.
It's not one thing. It's not one thing.
It's a multitude of possibilities. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you, Neil.
Have I worn everybody out? Perhaps so.
Well, I think what I particularly noticed is how it's almost like you almost look at everything you're doing as a philosophical question, and you approach it, starting at the very sort of bottom line, and then you start working your way through all the problems and all the concepts around it. And it's a really interesting approach, and it's certainly taken you in so many directions. It's
Well, you're right, Deborah. And I think, I remember the first time I really, I'm not sure I've understood it, and I know I don't do it very well, but when I heard the expression, and this really comes out of academe, and probably, those students who are, it's probably more often now that we see this in master's level programs, whether they're MFAs or MAs or MArch programs, you hear the expression that that we we need a research question.
Yeah.
But I think you have to have a certain amount of experience in your life. I know I certainly needed 30 years of it before that I could process that. And I know younger people have to process it much earlier, and some do, and some do because they're in programs and they have mentors and teachers that make it evident to them very, in their younger lives. I don't think it's always something that we talk about in the craft so much, and I don't think it's necessary to talk about all the time, but I think it's worth asking the question, do certain things warrant or benefit by having a research question? And even if your answer is no, I can't come up with a single question, we at least ask ourselves, do we think we can find one there? Because sometimes I think that helps us sort of, at the beginning of a project, broaden the parameters super wide, and then allows you to narrow. As I said to Meg in her question, that last project I showed you, it's super wide, and disjunctive at times, and sometimes overly stylized. I see a number of things in it now that I wonder about. But sometimes just asking enough questions, making a model of something in clay or what's available to you, especially if it's a bigger project, then it's very useful. It doesn't benefit everything. It's an impediment for certain ways of working in our media. You don't want anything to intervene that immediate tactile haptic experience. And so get out of the way, and just do something is important in so much of what we do. But other times, we invite the big picture in. It's sort of like invite a big party into your life, and then and then kick out the guests, as you find them intrusive.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. It's that, why am I doing this? Question. Thank you, Neil.
All right. Thanks so much, Neil.
Thank you.
Fantastic to talk with you.
Yeah, well, it's great. Thank you for all your help, Jen, Deborah. Great. It's great what your organization is doing. I encourage you to go into to take a look at the intro for me, because there is something about that you'd be very interested in it, and it's a project that's run out of Boston Valley Terracotta. The only progressive, and really the key player in this continent's architectural terracotta world, and they do an architectural assemblies workshop that takes place, I believe, annually. And there are a few things that are going on in our field that are seem like they're not outliers. It's just that we don't know about them. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. There's a lot of really great research going on, even if you're not to be involved in it, to know what's going on and see how other people use your medium in your field. Because quite often I think we as ceramists have to take charge and be able to lend our love and our kind of special insights. We can loan them to others, who might be interested in them. I've got a student, Jordan McDonald, who lives now in Philadelphia, and he's doing some really interesting work with architects and designers in a very intimate object scale, that he uses all his insights as a kind of potter, and the language and discourse of that he has found in the historical threads that interest him. So it's a bigger field than I had any idea that it could be when I started. And I just always think it's kind of wonderful when we introduce ourselves to the other parts of it that that are a little harder to find. So that's how I'll end it.
And we're losing that intro, so please, everyone, Amy posted it, and it gives you all the information that Neil's talking about.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate this very much.
Thank you,
Well,
Neil. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Neil.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jan.